Omnilingual by H. Beam Piper. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, February 1957. Archived by Project Gutenberg. The next day, at lunch, Sachiko Korimitsu had the answer to the second question. 4 or 5 electrical engineers had come down by rocket from the ship, and she had been spending the morning with them, in oxymasks, at the top of the building. "Tony, I thought you said those generators were in good shape," she began, catching sight of Latimer. "They aren't. They're in the most unholy mess I ever saw. What happened up there was that the supports of the wind rotor gave way, and the weight snapped the main shaft and smashed everything under it." "Well, after 50,000 years, you can expect something like that," Latimer retorted. "When an archaeologist says something's in good shape, he doesn't necessarily mean it'll start as soon as you shove a switch in." "You didn't notice that it happened when the power was on, did you?" one of the engineers asked, nettled at Latimer's tone. "Well, it was. Everything's burned out or shorted or fused together. I saw one bus bar 8 inches across melted clean in 2. It's a pity we didn't find things in good shape, even archaeologically speaking. I saw a lot of interesting things in advance of what we're using now, but it'll take a couple of years to get everything sorted out and figure what it looked like originally." "Did it look as though anybody made an attempt to fix it?" Martha asked. Sachiko shook her head. "They must have taken one look at it and given up. I don't believe there would have been any possible way to repair anything." "Well, that explains why they left. They needed electricity for lighting and heating, and all their industrial equipment was electrical. They had a good life here with power. Without it, this place wouldn't have been habitable." "Then why did they barricade everything from the inside? And how did they get out?" Latimer wanted to know. "To keep the other people from breaking in and looting. Last man out probably barred the last door and slid down a rope from upstairs," von Olmhorst suggested. "The Houdini trick doesn't worry me too much. We'll find out eventually." "Yeah, about the time Martha starts reading Martian," Latimer scoffed. "That may be just when we'll find out," von Olmhorst replied seriously. "It wouldn't surprise me if they left something in writing when they evacuated this place." "Are you really beginning to treat this pipe dream of hers as a serious possibility, Salim?" Latimer demanded. "I know it would be a wonderful thing, but wonderful things don't happen just because they're wonderful, only because they're possible, and this isn't. Let me quote that distinguished Hittologist, Johann Friedrich. Nothing can be translated out of nothing. Or that later, but not less distinguished Hittologist, Salim von Olmhorst. Where are you going to get your bilingual?" "Friedrich lived to see the Hittite language deciphered and read," von Olmhorst reminded him. "Yes, when they found Hittite-Assyrian bilinguals." Latimer measured a spoonful of coffee powder into his cup and added hot water. "Martha, you ought to know, better than anybody, how little chance you have. You've been working for years in the Indus Valley. How many words of Harappa have you or anybody else ever been able to read? We never found a university with a 500,000 volume library at Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro. And the first day we entered this building, we established meanings for several words," Salim von Olmhorst added. "And you've never found another meaningful word since," Latimer added. "And you're only sure of general meaning, not specific meaning of word element. And you have a dozen different interpretations for each word. We made a start," von Olmhorst maintained. "We have Grotefen's word for king. But I'm going to be able to read some of those books over there, if it takes me the rest of my life here. It probably will, anyhow." "You mean you've changed your mind about going home on the Serrano?" Martha asked. "You'll stay on here?" The old man nodded. "I can't leave this. There's too much to discover. The old dog will have to learn a lot of new tricks, but this is where my work will be from now on." Latimer was shocked. "You're nuts!" he cried. "You mean you're going to throw away everything you've accomplished in Hittology and start all over again here on Mars? Martha, if you've talked him into this crazy decision, you're a criminal." "Nobody talked me into anything," von Olmhorst said roughly. "And as for throwing away what I've accomplished in Hittitology, I don't know what the devil you're talking about. Everything I know about the Hittite Empire is published and available to anybody. Hittitology's like Egyptology. It stopped being research and archaeology and become scholarship and history. And I'm not a scholar or a historian. I'm a pick and shovel field archaeologist, a highly skilled and specialized grave robber and junk picker. And there's more pick and shovel work on this planet than I could do in 100 lifetimes. This is something new. I was a fool to think I could turn my back on it and go back to scribbling footnotes about Hittite kings. You could have anything you wanted in Hittitology. There are a dozen universities that'd sooner have you than a winning football team. But no, you have to be the top man in Martiology too. You can't leave that for anybody else. Latimer shoved his chair back and got to his feet, leaving the table with an oath that was almost a sob of exasperation. Maybe his feelings were too much for him. Maybe he realized, as Martha did, what he had betrayed. She sat, avoiding the eyes of the others, looking at the ceiling, as embarrassed as though Latimer had flung something dirty on the table in front of them. Tony Latimer had, desperately, wanted Selim to go home on the Serrano. Martiology was a new field. If Selim entered it, he would bring with him the reputation that he had already built in hittology, automatically stepping into a leading role that Latimer had coveted for himself. Ivan Fitzgerald's words echoed back to her. When you want to be a big shot, you can't bear the possibility of anybody else being a bigger big shot. His derision of her own efforts became comprehensible, too. It wasn't that he was convinced that she would never learn to read the Martian language. He had been afraid that she would. Ivan Fitzgerald finally isolated the germ that had caused the Finchley girl's undiagnosed illness. Shortly afterward, the malady turned into a mild fever, from which she recovered. Nobody else seemed to have caught it. Fitzgerald was still trying to find out how the germ had been transmitted. They found a globe of Mars, made when the city had been a seaport. They located the city, and learned that his name had been Kukan, or something with a similar vowel-consonant ratio. Immediately, Sid Chamberlain and Gloria Standish began giving their telecasts a Kukan dateline, and Hubert Penrose used the name in his official reports. They also found a Martian calendar. The year had been divided into 10 more or less equal months, and one of them had been Doma. Another month was Nor, and that was part of the name of the scientific journal Martha had found. Bill Chandler, the zoologist, had been going deeper and deeper into the old sea bottom of Syrtis. 400 miles from Kukan, and at 15,000 feet at lower altitude, he shot a bird. At least, it was something with wings and what were almost, but not quite, feathers, though it was more reptilian than avian in general characteristics. He and Ivan Fitzgerald skinned and mounted it, and then dissected the carcass almost tissue by tissue. About 7/8 of its body capacity was lungs. It certainly breathed air containing at least half enough oxygen to support human life, or 5 times as much as the air around Kukan. That took the center of interest away from archaeology, and started a new burst of activity. All the expedition's aircraft, 4 jetacopters and 3 wingless airdyne reconnaissance fighters, were thrown into intensified exploration of the lower sea bottoms, and bioscience boys and girls were wild with excitement in making new discoveries on each flight. The university was left to Selim and Martha and Tony Latimer, the latter keeping to himself while she and the old Turco-German worked together. The civilian specialists in other fields, and the Space Force people who had been holding tape lines and making sketches and snapping cameras, were all flying to lower Syrtis to find out how much oxygen there was and what kind of life it supported. Sometimes Sachiko dropped in. Most of the time she was busy helping Ivan Fitzgerald dissect specimens. They had 4 or 5 species of what might loosely be called birds, and something that could easily be classified as a reptile, and a carnivorous mammal the size of a cat with bird-like claws, and an herbivore almost identical with the pig-like thing in the big Darfulva mural, and another gazelle with a single horn in the middle of its forehead. The high point came when one party, at 30,000 feet below the level of Kukan, found breathable air. One of them had a mild attack of soroche and had to be flown back for treatment in a hurry, but the others showed no ill effects. The daily newscasts from Terra showed a corresponding shift in interest at home. The discovery of the university had focused attention on the dead past of Mars. Now the public was interested in Mars as a possible home for humanity. It was Tony Latimer who brought archaeology back into the activities of the expedition and the news at home. Martha and Selim were working in the museum on the 2nd floor, scrubbing the grime from the glass cases, noting contents, and grease-penciling numbers. Latimer and a couple of Space Force officers were going through what had been the administrative offices on the other side. It was one of these, a young second lieutenant, who came hurrying in from the mezzanine, almost bursting with excitement. "Hey, Martha! Dr. von Olmhorst," he was shouting. "Where are you? Tony's found the Martians!" Selim dropped his rag back in the bucket. She laid her clipboard on top of the case beside her. "Where?" they asked together. "Over on the north side." The lieutenant took hold of himself and spoke more deliberately. "Little room, back of one of the old faculty offices. Conference room. It was locked from the inside, and we had to burn it down with a torch. That's where they are. 18 of them around a long table. Gloria Standish, who had dropped in for lunch, was on the mezzanine, fairly screaming into a radiophone extension. 1.5 of them! Well, of course they're dead. What a question. They look like skeletons covered with leather. No, I do not know what they died of. Well, forget it. I don't care if Bill Chandler's found a 3-headed hippopotamus. Sid, don't you get it? We found the Martians! She slammed the phone back on its hook, rushing away ahead of them. Martha remembered the closed door. On the first survey, they hadn't attempted opening it. Now it was burned away at both sides and lay, still hot along the edges, on the floor of the big office room in front. A floodlight was on in the room inside, and Latimer was going around looking at things while a Space Force officer stood by the door. The center of the room was filled by a long table. In armchairs around it sat the 18 men and women who had occupied the room for the last 50 millennia. There were bottles and glasses on the table in front of them, and, had she seen them in a dimmer light, she would have thought that they were merely dozing over their drinks. One had a knee hooked over his chair arm, and was curled in a fetus-like sleep. Another had fallen forward onto the table, arms extended, the emerald set of a ring twinkling dully on one finger. Skeletons covered with leather, Gloria Standish had called them, and so they were, faces like skulls, arms and legs like sticks, the flesh shrunken onto the bones under it. "Isn't this something?" Latimer was exulting. "Mass suicide, that's what it was. Notice what's in the corners?" Braziers, made of perforated 2-gallon odd metal cans, the white walls smudged with smoke above them. Von Olmhorst had noticed them at once and was poking one of them with his flashlight. "Yes, charcoal. I noticed a quantity of it around a couple of hand forges in the shop on the first floor. That's why you had so much trouble breaking in. They'd sealed the room on the inside." He straightened and went around the room until he found a ventilator and peered into it. Stuffed with rags. They must have been all that were left here. Their power was gone and they were old and tired, and all around them their world was dying. So they just came in here and lit the charcoal, and sat drinking together till they all fell asleep. Well, we know what became of them now, anyhow. Sid and Gloria made the most of it. The Terran public wanted to hear about the Martians, and if live Martians couldn't be found, a room full of dead ones was the next best thing. Maybe an even better thing. It had been only 60-odd years since the Orson Welles invasion scare. Tony Latimer, the discoverer, was beginning to cash in on his attentions to Gloria and his ingratiation with Sid. He was always either making voice and image talks for the telecast or listening to the news from the home planet. Without question, he had become, overnight, the most widely known archaeologist in history. "Not that I'm interested in all this for himself," he disclaimed, after listening to the telecast from Terra 2 days after his discovery. "But this is going to be a big thing for Martian archaeology. Bring it to the public attention. Dramatize it. Salim, can you remember when Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter found the tomb of Tutankhamun? In 1923? I was 2 years old then," Von Olmhorst chuckled. "I really don't know how much that publicity ever did for Egyptology. Oh, the museums did devote more space to Egyptian exhibits, and after a museum department head gets a few extra showcases, you know how hard it is to make him give them up. And for a while, it was easier to get financial support for new excavations, but I don't know how much good all this public excitement really does in the long run." "Well, I think one of us should go back on the Cyrano when the Schiaparelli orbits in," Latimer said. "I'd hoped it would be you. Your voice would carry the most weight. But I think it's important that one of us go back, to present the story of our work, and what we have accomplished and what we hope to accomplish, to the public and to the universities and the learned societies, and to the Federation government. There will be a great deal of work that will have to be done. We must not allow the other scientific fields and the so-called practical interests to monopolize public and academic support. So, I believe I shall go back, at least for a while, and see what I can do. Lectures. The organization of a Society of Martian Archaeology, with Anthony Latimer, Ph.D., the logical candidate for the chair. Degrees, honors, the defense of the learned, and the adulation of the lay public. Positions with impressive titles and salaries. Sweet are the uses of publicity. She crushed out her cigarette and got to her feet. "Well, I still have the final lists of what we found in Hallhulva, biology, department to check over. I'm starting on Sornhulva tomorrow, and I want that stuff in shape for expert evaluation." That was the sort of thing Tony Latimer wanted to get away from, the detail work and the drudgery. Let the infantry do the slogging through the mud. The brass hats got the medals. She was halfway through the 5th floor, a week later, and was having midday lunch in the reading room on the 1st floor, when Hubert Penrose came over and sat down beside her, asking her what she was doing. She told him. "I wonder if you could find me a couple of men for an hour or so," she added. "I'm stopped by a couple of jammed doors at the central hall. Lecture room and library, if the layout of that floor is anything like the ones below it." "Yes, I'm a pretty fair doorbuster myself." He looked around the room. There's Jeff Miles, he isn't doing much of anything, and we'll put Sid Chamberlain to work for a change, too. The four of us ought to get your doors open." He called to Chamberlain, who was carrying his tray over to the dishwasher. "Oh, Sid, you doing anything for the next hour or so?" "I was going up to the 4th floor to see what Tony's doing." "Forget it. Tony's bagged his season limit of Martians. I'm going to help Martha bust in a couple doors. We'll probably find a whole cemetery full of Martians." Chamberlain shrugged. "Why not? A jammed door can have anything back of it, and I know what Tony's doing. Just routine stuff." Jeff Miles, the Space Force captain, came over, accompanied by one of the lab crew from the ship who had come down on the rocket the day before. "This ought to be up your alley, Mort," he was saying to his companion. "Chemistry and physics department. Want to come along?" The lab man, Mort Tranter, was willing. Seeing the sights was what he'd come down from the ship for. She finished her coffee and cigarette, and they went out into the hall together, gathered equipment, and rode the elevator to the 5th floor. The lecture hall door was the nearest. They attacked it first. With proper equipment and help, it was no problem, and in 10 minutes they had it open wide enough to squeeze through with the floodlights. The room inside was quite empty, and, like most of the rooms behind closed doors, comparatively free from dust. The students, it appeared, had sat with their backs to the door, facing a low platform, but their seats and the lecturer's table and equipment had been removed. The two side walls bore inscriptions. On the right, a pattern of concentric circles which he recognized as a diagram of atomic structure, and on the left, a complicated table of numbers and words in 2 columns. Tranter was pointing at the diagram on the right. "They got as far as the Bohr atom, anyhow," he said. "Well, not quite. They knew about electron shells, but they have the nucleus pictured as a solid mass. No indication of proton and neutron structure. I'll bet, when you come to translate their scientific books, you'll find that they taught the atom was the ultimate and indivisible particle. That explains why you people never found any evidence that the Martians used nuclear energy." "That's a uranium atom," Captain Miles mentioned. "It is?" Sid Chamberlain asked excitedly. "Then they did know about atomic energy. Just because we haven't found any pictures of A-bomb mushrooms doesn't mean—" She turned to look at the other wall. Sid's signal reactions were getting away from him again. Uranium meant nuclear power to him, and the two words were interchangeable. As she studied the arrangement and numbers of words, she could hear Tranter saying, "Nuts, Sid. We knew about uranium a long time before anybody found out what could be done with it. Uranium was discovered on Terra in 1789 by Klaproth." There was something familiar about the table on the left wall. She tried to remember what she had been taught in school about physics, and what she had picked up by accident afterward. The second column was a continuation of the first. There were 46 items in each numbered consecutively. "Probably used uranium because it's the largest of the natural atoms," Penrose was saying. "The fact there's nothing beyond it there shows that they hadn't created any of the transuranics. A student could go to that thing and point out the outer electron of any of the 92 elements." Thank you for being here. I hope you found what you wanted, be it entertainment or information. A link to the next part, if it's available, is on your screen right now. All of my content is free to access and without advertising, and the plan is to keep it that way. However, if you're feeling generous and want to help support my content, feel free to send some spare change my way through the links in the description.